Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's talk, sponsored by the Central Asia Working Group under the auspices of the Institute of East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley. This is an initiative that aims to bring Eurasia into focus by fostering campus-wide dialogue between faculty, visiting scholars, and graduate students working on the region. Before introducing the speaker, a note on housekeeping. Please use the Q&A tab to type in your questions at any point during or after the talk. I will try and get to as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. For any technical issues, please use the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker today, Moritz Pieper, has been working for the German Foreign Service since 2020. Before that, he was a research associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin and lecturer in international relations at the University of Salford, Manchester in the UK. He holds a Ph.D. from the University of Kent and completed his postgraduate studies in Canterbury and Moscow. He is the author of Hegemony and Resistance Around the Iranian Nuclear Program, as well as the book just published and available soon in the US called The Making of Eurasia, Competition and Cooperation Between China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia, on which his talk today is based. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Frank, and many thanks for inviting me. Thanks also for inviting me the first time, which would have been a live encounter in Berkeley back in March 2020, but then unfortunately the pandemic got in the way. So I'm very glad we get to meet in this form now, in this format. I embarked, as Frank has just mentioned, on a longer term research project, which took me 3 years of research on the effects on basically on Eurasia of the Sino-Russian interaction. And what particularly interested me was the effects on the in-betweens, as they are referred to in some of the literature. So in particular, I studied the effects of the Sino-Russian interaction on Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, but also other places in between, and on inter-regional effects across the Eurasian space. So this book came out with IB Tauris in October this year, will be or should be available in the US shortly, at the latest next month. And yeah, so research took me from the Bibliothèque François Mitterrand in Paris to Mongolian yurts, from office buildings in Moscow via windy Astana, back then when it was still called Astana, all the way to the Chinese-Kazakh border. So in this presentation, I will try and condense the findings of that research, in which I focus in particular on those effects of the Sino-Russian dynamic on these particular in-betweens. I will also say something on the effects of China and Russia's policies on inter-regional politics across Eurasia, and then finally on feedback effects of these dynamics on what we might term global governance. So I started this when I was still working as an academic, as Frank has just mentioned. I then joined the German Foreign Office last year. Luckily, this was when the book almost was about to be sent to production. But so I still need to add the disclaimer that I'm speaking in a private capacity here. So first, since I have it in the title of the book, what is the BRI? What is China's Belt and Road? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, since there are so many talks on that already. There's so much out there, there's so much literature by now. But basically, in 2013, when President Xi Jinping went to Kazakhstan, to Nazarbayev University at Astana to announce the Silk Road Economic Belt as the land-based variant of what would then later become the Belt and Road Initiative. He presented the initiative as a means to revitalize economic corridors across the Eurasian space. So revitalizing the ancient Silk Roads through the creation of new economic corridors in this, put in this very fanciful language of economic corridors that would be beneficial to not only China's Chinese Western provinces, but its Central Asian neighbors as well. I'll try to share my screen. So what we see here is a picture that I took in Urumqi at the bazaar there, which is just one illustration of the ubiquity of the Silk Road imagery, part of which is, of course, an invention of tradition, but this is sort of the language that China harks back to when it proposed the Belt and Road Initiative, or the Yidai Yilu, the One Belt, One Road, as it was still labeled back then in 2013. So of course, this all is a language it serves to couch Chinese outward policies in that language of Silk Road revival. And I know you had Tim Winter here in this webcast series, who already talked about the sort of geo-economic and geocultural power behind that. Then we have a picture I took here at Urumqi airport. So Urumqi, of course, as the capital of Xinjiang province, remains a key transit town for this endeavor to connect China with its Western neighbors. And it is no coincidence that posters such as this one are visible everywhere at the Urumqi airport. And sort of China boasts of the gold port Alashanku at the border that show this arriving train next to a wall of cargo containers. So of course, with the focus on infrastructure, on cargo, etc., in its Western neighborhood initially, the initiative then took a global turn some 2-3 years later, which then also saw the rebranding of the initiative to BRI in its English alteration, even though, of course, the Chinese label Yidai Yilu still stayed the same. And that global turn is important for this book, which I wrote because this global BRI is basically it's about the limitlessness, which concerns many Western observers, of course, and where we can see China's growing presence in a range of policy domains in more than 60 countries in the world by now. But what interested me for this research, for this book, was to look at the effects of that initiative on Central Asian countries in between Russia and China, so in between their shared, or basically countries in their shared neighborhood. Because obviously the elephant in the room was back then, how would Russia react? The conventional wisdom on the Sino-Russian dynamic argues that there's a division of labor. China has become the predominant economic powerhouse, while Russia has been granted the right to remain a preeminent security actor, and has used regional institutions like the Eurasian Economic Union, but also the Collective Security Treaty Organization as institutions to retain that influence and to fend off outside influence. Even though relations between Russia and China have historically been ambivalent, full of mutual misgivings, and I know Franck had his own book on the Sino-Russian borderlands, which came out recently. So I'm very much looking forward to reading that as well. On the edge. So there's a wealth of literature already on this ambivalent relationship. But when the BRI was announced in 2013, Russia took about 1.5 years to react. And then the official declaration, which only came in May 2015, was basically a reaction to align the Eurasian Economic Union, so a Russian-dominated economic union, with the Belt and Road Initiative. So giving a signal that China's BRI is officially not seen as a threat, and that China is going to slowly embrace Chinese connectivity initiatives. But China's slow embrace arguably also was an indication of what Russia read into the BRI, or of its interpretation of what the BRI was supposed to be, namely a Chinese strategy to bind Eurasia closer to China. And in the process, China, as it was read in Moscow, was likely to gain more political leverage at the expense of Moscow. So this focus on the Sino-Russian dynamic, I always found tends to deny agency on the part of other actors, and that's what triggered my interest in looking into the effects in places like Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. So I'll say something on each of these in turn before making some general observations. Mongolia is a pony between two elephants. That's how former President Elbek Dorst once put it. And it pretty much it pretty well encapsulates what Mongolia's delicate geopolitical situation, sandwiched as it is between Russia and China, so the two Eurasian giants, sitting at the crossroads between China's outreach in the wake of the Belt and Road Initiative, and with its historical and political-economic ties to Russia, even though it was never part of the Soviet Union, but a closely aligned brotherly socialist state. Then, like all members of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, the fall of the Soviet Union meant an economic shock for Mongolia, as the country was closely integrated into Russia's political economy. So in the 1990s, Russia and Mongolia had to find a new way of forging ties, post-Soviet ties, in which Mongolia was also trying to steer clear of too much outside influence of either of its two direct neighbors, namely China and Russia. So in that process, Mongolia developed a third neighbor policy, which meant that other than its two direct neighbors, Mongolia was reaching out to international so-called third neighbors in the 1990s in an attempt to recruit overseas partners for investments in all kinds of sectors of the economy. So Mongolia wanted to obviously be seen as more than just a buffer between these two Eurasian giants. I'll briefly share my screen again. Okay, so this is an illustration of the 6 proposed economic corridors subsumed under the Silk Road economic belt, and as you can see, one of them goes through Mongolian territory, even though initially this was not intended. This was not in the plans as announced in 2013. So it took some time for Mongolia to actively lobby to be included in this initiative. So today we can see historical references to the times when Mongolia was the ruler of the world, when Mongolia ruled over a vast part of the then known world, and when Marco Polo, whom we can see here, traveled to the court of Kublai Khan in the second half of the 13th century. Today as well, we have historical references that take place alongside the reality of modern business, as this picture shows that I took in downtown Ulaanbaatar, or this one as well. So who were these third neighbors then that brought new business, new opportunities to Mongolia in the 1990s? Well, China was one, Russia was another in parts of the economy, and also for the railway sector. But Mongolia was looking to Japan, South Korea, and Canadian investors in particular, as well as the multinational Rio Tinto and its mining industry. At the same time, Mongolia, being a democracy as it is, Mongolia was trying to limit the involvement of foreign stakeholders in Mongolia's economy by way of rather restrictive legislation. So there was a fear of that Mongolia was going to sell out the country's industries. Chinese economic interests in Mongolia mainly were copper and coal mines. So with the emergence of a new connectivity discourse, to embrace the BRI as an opportunity to mitigate the effects of its landlocked status, it lobbied for the inclusion of its country into these economic corridors, and it presented its Step Road project as a useful complement to these infrastructure investments. This is remarkable, you would think, given the track record of steering clear of Russian and Chinese influence in the 90s, and of developing this third country neighborhood policy in the 1990s. But another perhaps more important factor that influences how Mongolia reacts to external policies is also the backlash effects that you can have at a societal level, because some of these Chinese mega projects at a societal level are not very popular on the ground. There is a notion that some of these projects that China implements tie Mongolian investors to a buy-in policy whereby Chinese workers and investors flock to the country without the local economy benefiting much. And secondly, also there's a certain disrespect for cultural and religious sensitivities. And an indication of that, or a notorious example, was when the Dalai Lama came to visit Mongolia in 2016, to which China reacted by basically closing the border and even imposing sanctions, economic sanctions, which is something that of course contradicts China's official parlance, its official policy that sanctions are not a policy that China adopts. It began to impose fees on the import of commodities, and China even suspended bilateral talks on on further economic projects. So this was a strong reaction, and it was seen by Mongolian business communities, by political constituencies, as something where Mongolia is perhaps vulnerable to a bigger partner next door. Finally, memberships in international organizations also need to be factored in. Mongolia is not a member of the SCO, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's not a member of the Eurasian Economic Union either. So it does not partake in these regional discussions, institutional discussions. So in a sense, it is freer to conduct its economic policies, foreign policies, without these memberships. Freedom can also be interpreted as a vulnerability, seeing as we have the small Mongolian labor market that puts the country at a disadvantage in the face of stronger external partners.
Okay.
So if we then move to Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan has likewise been confronted with challenges that result from its institutional and spatial overlap between the Eurasian Economic Union, and we see here a map of the EU members, of which Kazakhstan is one, and the Chinese sponsored Silk Road Economic Belt. Kazakhstan sees itself as the linchpin of Eurasia, as the central hub of interregional trade flows. And it has always been a staunch supporter of cross-border initiatives. It has joined the Eurasian Economic Union, and it was quick to endorse the Belt and Road Initiative and saw it as a geo-economic game changer. Why is that the case? If you look at the country's central geography, this should not come as a surprise. And also, Kazakhstan saw its institutional membership of the Eurasian Economic Union here as an opportunity to not only become, let's say, exposed to Chinese investment interests, as we just saw in the Mongolian case, even though Mongolia had its own parliamentary debates on that, but whereby Kazakhstan can also make money off the transit of goods coming from China, going through Kazakhstan, and then for onwards trades into the Russian market or further European markets. This development, however, of trying to make the best out of both EAU membership and being a sort of transit space for anything aligned with the Silk Road Economic Belt, also affects Kazakhstan's professed multi-vector foreign policy. So similar to what we saw in Mongolia, where you have a third country neighborhood policy, Kazakhstan since the 1990s developed a multi-vector foreign policy, as Kazakhstan's location was sort of that geostrategic hub at the crossroads of these different initiatives. The border crossing point at Khorgos symbolizes that quite well. And this is a picture I took at Khorgos, where you see that Khorgos is already, it's being advertised as having enormous transit potential, as being a land full of preferential policies, and as a duty-free shopping paradise. Khorgos already is a key border crossing point for the Central Asia China natural gas pipeline running from Turkmenistan to China, And the announcement of the BRI then meant an additional boost for Khargos, as it has a dry port, which was then elevated to a key gateway for the Silk Road economic belt with potentially huge transit potential. One logistical consideration, and you can see here an advertisement of Khargos from the Chinese side. You can see here the official narrative of Khargos being where the east meets the west. And you can see the dry port in the background. This is my own picture of the dry port. And as you can see, I went to visit the place. One logistical consideration concerns the track gauges. And you can see here to the right, the Kazakh track gauges, and to the left of the picture, you see the Chinese flag for the Chinese track gauges, which are slightly narrower than the Kazakh track gauges, as all former Soviet Union countries are. So goods coming from China to Kazakhstan and vice versa have to be shifted onto the other respective track gauge by cranes. So this is something that again illustrates the transit potential, where the Kazakhs are happy to portray themselves as intermediaries, as it were, of these mega projects in the making. However, skeptics speculate that the zone would serve primarily as a trading hub for Kazakhstani middlemen to re-export cheap Chinese products to sell them elsewhere across Eurasia. You can see here a restaurant called Blue Sky and Silk Road. You can see here lines of people lining up to enter the border crossing point. And these are obviously people trying to buy household items, reselling them elsewhere, tax advantages in the special economic zone. So this is perhaps not the kind of, it's perhaps not the kind of second Dubai that some people have thought it might be. But for our purposes here, the more important point is that the questions of tariffs with goods coming from one country to another symbolizes wider dynamics of Sino-Russian Kazakh triangular relations in external trade and foreign policy. The Kazakh EU membership has also produced ambivalent results, has been debated domestically, and Kazakhstan has critiqued the politicization of the EU on the part of Russia. So it's not as rosy as you might expect. However, officially, the Kazakh government has also aligned its own domestic infrastructure project, the Nurli Zhol or Bright Path, to both the Silk Road economic belt, as well as portraying it as a beneficial complement to the Eurasian Economic Union. And Russians and Chinese, having worked on their own sopragenia, as it was then called, or docking of the two initiatives, the Eurasian Economic Union and the Silk Road economic belt, Kazakhstan has done the same with the Nurli Zhol and the Silk Road economic belt, which again irritated the Russians. So you see there are a couple of triangular tensions and dynamics involved here. Kazakhstan also deals with China through its own bilateral channels. Obviously, while there are working groups that Russia set up on behalf of the Eurasian Economic Union to deal with China, interestingly, without consulting other EU members before. So there's an implicit tension in these sort of dynamics in the making. Final point on Kazakhstan. This official embrace of the Silk Road economic belt as a game changer has also met with mixed reactions on the ground on the part of business and local communities. There were some partially violent anti-Chinese protests in Kazakhstan over reports that China was planning to relocate factories to Kazakhstan. So again, this narrative of overexposure, economic exploitation that irritates parts of local communities, as well as the fate of ethnic Kazakhs in in Xinjiang, which is also being watched with alarm and concern on the other side of the border. If we then turn to Uzbekistan, this is an interesting example of smaller, but geographically perhaps even more central and therefore important Central Asian countries that are rethinking their strategic outlooks in a changing political environment such as this. Economically, of course, Uzbekistan had perpetuated a system of institutionalized rent-seeking under President Karimov. And it was only when Karimov died in 2016 and the coming to power of President Mirziyoyev that Uzbekistan began to open up. The Uzbek economy experienced an unprecedented liberalization, an exchange rate reform liberalized the currency, which for many years had been kept artificially low, and trade and regulatory barriers were lifted. So this all started to happen at a time when China reached out across the Eurasian space, when this Belt and Road Initiative across Eurasia was finding new contract partners. So this discourse made Uzbekistan also a natural choice as it was opening up, and as the narrative then focused on rejuvenating cross-regional connections along the routes of the ancient Silk Road. So of course, for that narrative, Uzbekistan with Bukhara, Samarkand, and you know all these Silk Road sites was a perfect fit discursively already. We also had a similar striking docking frenzy, you might say, between the BRI and a complementary domestic program, whereby Uzbekistan worked on a new strategy for development for the years 2017 to 21, and the Silk Road Economic Belt. So again, something we saw with Mongolia aligning its step roads program with the BRI, Kazakhstan aligning Nur-Lijol with the BRI, and Uzbekistan trying to latch on to some of these initiatives as well, with the hope of unleashing the potential for its own domestic labor market. Importantly, though, is that these are separate processes. Uzbekistan's reform agenda was domestically orientated after the death of Karimov. These can be potentially reinforcing processes, but we should not read a causality into Uzbekistan opening up because the BRI comes at a convenient time. Then again, we have an underlying question of competition and cooperation, depending on the policy domain we look at, between Russia and China, because labor migration remains an area where Russia remains dominant, continues to be a top destination for Uzbeks going abroad and sending remittances back home. Russian continues to be spoken widely, and as with other former Soviet Union countries, Russia's cultural influence and military presence remains strong. So this brings me to some general observations. Then we have domestic preference formation in some of these countries where the socio-political fabric of these so-called in-between countries is an important element we should not leave aside. There are recipient actors that are willingly taking up these economic cooperation programs, link it with their own domestic programs, even though there are heated debates in Mongolia over mining rights and investment laws, while there's the docking frenzy in Kazakhstan or Mongolia, or in other parts of Mongolia or Uzbekistan, for instance. Then there's an impact of governance models. There's a democratic governance culture in Mongolia, which has allowed for more parliamentary debates about the pros and cons of China becoming more dominant in the mining sector, for instance, which has led to Mongolia encouraging Japan and South Korea to come to the country. While criticism of foreign economic policies has been more muted in Kazakhstan, or Uzbekistan, where the space for civil society has been shrinking. So authoritarian governance models versus democratic governance models also makes a difference in the extent to which these countries choose to react to Sino-Russian mega projects in the neighborhood. Where are the US and Europe in all this? Obviously, the potential limitlessness, as I mentioned in the beginning, of this initiative, of the BRI, and of Russia reacting to it in a way that reduces the potential for conflict between Russia and China at the time when the normative divide between Russia and the West has widened, at the latest since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. This is a context in which the US and the EU find themselves perhaps as yet another in-between, not geographically perhaps, but geopolitically at a global plane. And we saw just one day ago the European Commission announcing its global gateway as a multi-billion proposal for the EU to boost sustainable links around the world. We saw the Biden administration announcing its Build Back Better narrative and policy program, also out of a clear recognition that the Sino-American rivalry is going to be a foreign policy priority for the United States. So these are reactions that are coming out of Washington and European capitals, and Europe in particular, as it is at the westernmost endpoint of the projected economic corridors that are emerging out of the BRI, at least on the Eurasian continent. And finally, perhaps, where are we going from here? There are perhaps at least two scenarios. One in which Mongolia, the Central Asian states, and partners further west across the Eurasian space, like also smaller economies like Tajikistan, but also Iran at the Persian Gulf, feel this gravitational pull of the evolving partnership or evolving relationship between the region's biggest powers, but can maintain a foreign policy leeway of picking and choosing. They would then develop policies that accommodate parts of the mega projects and parts of this new order in the making, but can still combine it or complement it with domestic programs. This is something that we saw in Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy, with Uzbekistan, or with the third neighbor policy of Mongolia. Regional organizations like the CSTO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, CIS, are of course formats that can serve to channel some of these regional discussions, but tend to be dominated by the biggest powers of the region again, of Eurasia again, in most parts Russia in these institutional settings. In the second scenario though, if Russia were to be completely marginalized by China in Eurasia, and the financial dependence of states like, say, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan could translate into a level of even political subordination, and would still continue to depend on Russia for security and migrant remittances, then we would see a compounding of these countries' external debt to China, while becoming less autonomous in any other policy domains as well. So this would completely leave out the option of picking and choosing foreign policy options, or balancing foreign policies, if you will. Final point, and then I'll stop. The BRI and other regional economic or not even economic, normative connectivity projects are couched, of course, in this language of economic corridors, in a very economic language, but they always contain an ideational element of forging transnational bonds. And beyond the convergence around the legitimacy of authoritarianism at a level of national governance, there's little societal resemblance between China and Russia, or between China and other actors across Central Asia, and that's a long-standing trope in studies of Chinese Central Asian relations as well. So the language of docking these regional integration initiatives can only serve to advance people-to-people ties so much. And I think I'll stop here and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for this this really interesting talk, and also for the book, which I read this week, and I really enjoyed it. And one of the points I thought was really that got me really excited, and then you've talked about that in your talk today, is the level of agency that these in between states have, because that's something that, with all the talk of the BRI and what is happening, is they're always given a not much of a role, not much of a place. So I think it's very important to actually look at what they can do, the agency that they have, and also I think something that's really important that you mentioned is that the way they are able, because of the amorphousness and elasticity of the BRI, to also plug in their own agenda within it, right? So you talk in terms of kind of a balancing act, I think, kind of a delicate balancing act in terms of trying to position their own needs with respect to the larger states of Russia and China. But I wanted to ask you a bit also about the level of the different effective resonance these two countries have. I mean, I can speak for Mongolia, but I think this also true in many ways for Central Asia, that Russia and China are not seen in the same way in Mongolia. I mean, there's a lot of ambivalence and tension towards China, a lot of anxiety that is not necessarily there for Russia. So how does that complicate the issue of trying to balance when the balancing of the two entities are not equally weighed? And what is China doing in terms of soft power, maybe to try and gain some ground? I don't know whether that's something you've kind of looked at, but as an anthropologist, it's kind of, kind of my interest as well, to see how culturally how people respond to these changes.
Yeah, I think that cuts right to the chase of the matter. I mean, China is using soft power, if you want to use that word, by setting up Confucius institutes, by trying to spread the learning of Chinese language, of Mandarin, of promoting film festivals, literature festivals. So all these kind of basically public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy activities that also other states are doing. But of course, in some of these cases, some of these countries in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, you see that amongst segments of society, this is read as almost, an attempt to also work towards growing a wider audience, receptive to Chinese foreign policy perspectives, and the extent to which in Confucius institutes policies and politics get talked about is also an indication for those policies to be used as a sort of as an instrument to also forge certain political views, around Tibet, Taiwan, etc. Dalai Lama, the example of the really strong Chinese reaction to the Dalai Lama visit to Mongolia in 2016 being one notorious example, but also the fate of, as I mentioned, ethnic Kazakhs in neighboring Xinjiang, which even led to some Kazakh activists writing an open letter to then President Nazarbayev to address their fates, to become more active and come out and support ethnic Kazakhs in that regard, despite the official governmental embrace of all these good economic things that can come out of the BRI. And of course, Russia has not so much of a harder stance in many parts of Central Asia, as far as former Soviet Union countries countries are concerned, of course, since Russian was a lingua franca, is still widely spoken. So there's already a certain cultural familiarity that sort of helps with Russia's soft power, as it were. There are also similar standards. So if you talk to Uzbek officials, they will tell you, well, China is of course coming with big checkbooks, but we have still loads of, or we operate on the basis of the same standards as Russia does. So that already helps in many parts of many industrial sectors, etc. So that is also something next to cultural and linguistic familiarity that at a technical level is again making it easier for Russia to basically link it with a past level of familiarity, which again is not supposed to be that we have a path dependency here. It's not supposed to mean that we have a path dependency. Of course, things can change, and in Kazakhstan in particular, we saw consternation and concern being voiced after the Ukraine crisis, after the annexation of Crimea, and after nationalist politicians within Russia then they came out to suggest that that next up would be northern Kazakhstan might also be changed territorially in line with shifting foreign policy priorities. So these are voices that were heard, of course, in Kazakhstan also with concern, and where this argument that language and cultural familiarity and soft power from the past need not be a guarantee that things are continuing to be the same in the future. And so this is something where, of course, China is also hoping that it can perhaps not drive a wedge between the Central Asian populace or segments of society and Russia, but at least we're by offering cultural and educational opportunities, scholarships. China is very generously giving out scholarships. That this is something where Russia is perhaps not that active, and together with a more, should we say, disruptive foreign policy, or foreign policy that concerns a lot of partners in Central Asia as well. There might be a tendency for China, if played well, which again with all this, the wolf warrior diplomacy is another debate altogether. But where China is also not perhaps furthering its own interests, but where Russia might be more pursuing policies in the public diplomacy domain that are perhaps clumsier than some of the scholarship initiatives, educational opportunities that China comes up with. But it's an evolving relationship.
Thank you for this really full answer. We've got quite a few questions coming up, so I'm gonna read through some of them. Someone is wondering what your opinion is about the new organization of Turkic states, because that's something we haven't really talked about in that region. It's not just China and Russia, but there's also the Turkic element. Could you say something about that? Could that be an alternative to the or complicated relationship?
So far, not a lot. I mean, the Turkic Turkic language communities are also one transnational bond stretching from Turkmenistan, or from Turkey, Turkmenistan to parts of China and Xinjiang historically, and I mean that's it could be one organization or one umbrella or platform for this latter part that I mentioned, the sort of ideational ties or a sort of more ideational association that can also then voice or find a stronger voice in foreign policy, or at least to articulate a sort of pan-Turkic, if you will, voice in a regional and institutional setting, which could then also be relayed to other regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But the extent to which, again, the bigger regional players like Russia and China tend to dominate the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, including its definition of terrorism and separatism, there might be, I mean, you can expect a strong reaction coming out of Beijing and Moscow with anything that smells of sort of pan-Turkic ideational associations that could be interpreted as a pretext for separatism. So this is sort of the besides its ideational potential and potential to be used as a platform to articulate foreign policy interests on the part of ethnic communities as well, that this is a more problematic environment in which it has to operate.
Somebody's asking a question about the quality of the relationship between Russia and China, and that's something I think you address in your book, namely to an extent their good relation now is linked to their own relationship with the West that has deteriorated. If that relationship with the West changes, do you think the Russia-China relationship will still be as strong as it is now?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I tried to highlight as well when I mentioned that the normative divide has widened between Russia and the West. I mean, it's a long-standing trope by now, but I mean, especially these days, if you've been following the news, there are more and more indications for this normative divide, and the sort of conventional or a narrative often repeated in that regard is that if you think back to Macron's initiative of 2017 of reaching out to Moscow, or at least finding a new European approach to Russia, this would be or this could be a strategy to prevent Russia from being driven into the arms of the Chinese, to sort of wrap it up in a nutshell. So sort of this Kissingerian or anti-Kissingerian moment of Macron, harking back to the times when Kissinger went to Beijing to sort of drive a wedge between communist China and the Soviet Union. But of course this misses the point that of course it's a having stable relationships with Russia is a foreign policy priority for Europe, for many European governments. But one has to be clear-eyed about the prospects and the starting points. So having good relations for the sake of having good relations has to also has to start with the recognition of past grievances and violations of international law, and this is something that makes it hard to start from scratch because we are scared of China's BRI, or scared of the potential limitlessness of the BRI, to which we then have to respond by embracing Moscow. So this is sort of this is a two-pronged approach that does not work in that linear fashion, and yeah, that's why Russia and China are also of course realizing where to push and pull if they look at the West, which again is not a monolithic bloc either, but the kind of strings they can pull with different European governments, and as well as the US. And final point on that, during the Corona crisis, last year we also saw that China and Russia, as much as I try to emphasize in this book, and I hope to have done that in this talk as well, that the changing of order, or the sustaining of order, does not follow from a blueprint, does not follow from a Chinese-Russian blueprint to upend the liberal international order, or to remake Eurasia in their own image. And events like a global pandemic again remind us that Russia and China have their differences as well. I mean, Russia was very quick to close the border, the 2,600-mile border between Russia and China. Very quickly, or for the first time, China then also reached out to the 5 Central Asian states and held a first virtual C+C5 meeting, so China plus the Central Asian 5, without Moscow, as an indication, perhaps of a tendency where in a post-pandemic geopolitical environment in Eurasia, China is also happy to engage with Central Asian countries without the tutelage of Moscow, and that's the Soviet legacy is also not a path dependency, as I said before, for Moscow to have good relations with the Central Asians, or preferential relations with the Central Asian states. So lots of tensions as well there between Russia and China, and at the same time, Russia also had its own combined meetings of the CIS, so the Commonwealth of Independent States, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization in I think September or October last year it was. So this also was a very forceful message that Russia is in the driver's seat of these meetings and decisions of continental importance, and does not have to consult China. Against the backdrop of constitutional crises last year in Belarus, in Kyrgyzstan, and the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, this was a forceful message that also Russia wanted to be heard in Beijing. So lots of these dynamics pulling in different dimensions. So it's not that easy to conceive of Russia and China as sort of at the forefront of an anti-Western alliance, which is not easy to break up in either way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good points. Okay, somebody's asking whether small countries such as Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan might also benefit from the One Belt, One Road, or from BRI initiative, because you talked about countries like Kazakhstan and Mongolia and Uzbekistan are important in terms of their location, in terms of their resources or space. But what about smaller countries? Do you think they would also benefit? Is there space for them to play the game and basically to find their own space and leverage something to get what they want? Yeah.
Is there space for them to co-shape? Mm-hmm. I mean, Tajikistan is very heavily dependent on remittances, migrant remittances. So and here it is. I mean, this is one example where Russia has a sort of strong presence militarily, but also economically there, because many Tajiks travel north and go to the Russian labor market and then send remittances back home. Kyrgyzstan is another interesting example where, of course, it's located right on the border of Xinjiang. So it is one of China's most direct, smaller Central Asian neighbors, and this also has led to a almost complete compounding of external debt to China. So Kyrgyzstan was one of these countries. I do mention it in the book. I didn't mention it specifically here, but where Chinese investments have also had very negative consequences. and where it's not always clear whether the Kyrgyz have sold out to Chinese powerful state companies, or whether some private actors have simply, had bad negotiation skills or bad management skills, and that for me was always, or at least that was also an important lesson that came out of my research, at least for myself, was that we should not conflate white elephants or failed investment decisions in both within China domestically, but also abroad in places like Kyrgyzstan, with a central governmental interest in doing X, Y, Z. So Chinese government actors, of course, are behind the Belt and Road Initiative, but this then often trickles down as a sort of narrative which private companies, private actors can pick up and use in their own right, or use in their own interest, using it as a discursive justification for the kind of business decisions they may have done anyways without the BRI, but which are of course useful to integrate into the BRI framework as a sort of a public justification. And there was an electricity plant in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan's capital, which is a notorious example there, where it's not really clear whether. So first of all, the electricity plant went out, and Bishkek was without electricity for some time in freezing sub-zero winter temperatures, and there was a Chinese investor in this electricity plant. So again, this then tied into the whole debate of societal skepticism in Kyrgyzstan about being overexposed to China and corrupt politicians within the Kyrgyz government making decisions that don't really take into consideration what is good for Kyrgyz locals. But again, I just mentioned the word corruption is another factor here. This may not always be the inability of states like Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan to co-shape what is happening, or the deliberate decisions on the part of China to go out and make other countries bankrupt, but often an interplay of different factors where corruption on the part of local politicians also plays a big part. So yes, they do have a role. They are relevant in this panorama of what is happening on the ground across Eurasia. Geography is another factor which also impacts on their ability to, or their agency, their ability to exercise agency as well.
Thank you. No, it's a good thing to remind people that the amorphousness of the BRI, there's so many different actors. It's not just China, Russia, it's not just a matter of states, also the actors, various actors that benefit from that and use that narrative for their own objective. We have a question on security aspects of the BRI. Is China exporting security personnel and security and surveillance technologies to these Central Asian countries? And are the Central Asian governments seeing this security relationship as a way to shape their own domestic politics? That's an important question.
That was a speculation or a question on everyone's mind back in, well, let's say, think back to 2013 when China proposed the Silk Road Economic Belt, and then in its ever-growing dimensions of the One Belt, One Road, eventually becoming Belt and Roads in English, and expanding to ever more policy domains, from infrastructure initially to even covering global health. Corona was also coined as or China's reaction of distributing vaccine and masks in its mask diplomacy of last year was also branded as part of its health road Silk Health Road as another component of the BRI. So then, of course, security was another obvious policy domain where you might think, well, if China is branching out to all kinds of security, all kinds of policy domains that you can think of, then of course security is the next logical step. Not least because if you do export capital in order to finance infrastructure in partially climatically challenging, but also troubling regions as far as security conditions are concerned, then perhaps securing this infrastructure with troops, with mercenaries, if you will, with private security companies might make sense. Now, if you follow that logic, then you would think if you are a central policy planner thinking parts of our infrastructure go through countries that are not particularly receptive to our governmental discourse anyways, so securing that infrastructure makes sense. And we saw, I mean, this is a tendency that is in the making, or this is a process in the making. But what we do see is China building first military bases abroad. A Chinese general has visited, so a PLA, People's Liberation Army general, has visited Tajikistan to have talks, and Tajikistan is an example, because it was just mentioned before, where China has now also set up a military base, which, if this were to become a model to be repeated elsewhere, then it would also be a new let's say dimension in China's foreign policy, as so far, of course, China has mentioned that it is, of course, that it's not operating abroad. So by law, the People's Liberation Army was not allowed to operate abroad. But in 2016, China changed its law to that effect, which now formally makes it possible for the PLA also to operate in Central Asia. So read that as you will. It could be an indication for an increased PLA presence in other countries in years, decades to come. But of course, using private security companies is another way of doing that. If states don't want to revert to national armies, of course. Mm-hmm. There's a whole book on that. There's increasingly literature coming out on China's security profile, and on also the use of private military companies increasingly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We also have a question about the differences between the Biden and Trump administrations in the US and their response to BRI. Have there been any significant differences, or has there been continuity between these administrations?
Trump from the start didn't seem to have a clear interest or strategy for Central Asia. Biden so far doesn't have one either, but there is. I mean, we all remember the bellicose language that Trump used on China, calling it, from calling it the currency manipulator already during his election campaign, all the way to very bellicose language during his presidency on China's foreign policy and foreign economic policies. So you might have expected that a change of presidencies could make a difference in terms of tone, but also in policies. But so far, we see that the Biden administration is quite to the contrary, is putting China right at the top of its foreign policy agenda. And I mean, the Summit for Democracy taking place next week is, of course, it is there to show, to broadcast the power of democracy as a governance model. But of course, the whole setting also takes place in a geopolitical reading, whereby the non-invitation to China and Russia are clear geopolitical signals that we are in a global debate between democracies, global fight even between democracies and authoritarianism, or between democracy and authoritarianism as governance structures, but also as far as, if you look at the Sino-American rivalry, this has become, more than a buzzword in academic circles. This is now being recognized as a foreign policy priority in many parts of the administration. So from Treasury to State Department to the White House, there's a consolidated, there's a coherent narrative that is being put out on China, and even though there are, we recently had the Xi Biden meeting, digital meeting, to kind of soothe the rhetoric, but the underlying structural reasons for that rivalry are still there. And Biden's Build Back Better program, as I mentioned during the talk, is one example where the US is now also realizing that other than pressuring and lobbying allies around the world to join its cause, it also needs to support Central Asian states, perhaps financially, in terms of infrastructure. Of course, this enormous infrastructure program is directed for a domestic audience and a domestic infrastructure renewal in the first place. But the whole Build Back Better world narrative is of course clearly aimed at presenting a counter narrative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, or China's now global narrative, if you will.
Thank you. Earlier you mentioned a recent book on PRC private security companies. Do you have the name in offhand? Do you remember? Otherwise, if you can send it to me later, I'll send it to the person who asked.
I'll look it. I'll pop it in the chat box.
Okay.
I'll quickly look it up.
Okay. Or you can do it later. It's fine. I think we just have one more question, because the person who asked the remaining questions had to leave. So there's somebody I can put you in touch later if you want. So somebody mentioning the opening up of Uzbekistan, the change from Cyrillic to Roman alphabet. There's been some kind of need maybe to take some distance from the Soviet Union, from Moscow. Do you see an opening for China in that respect, in that kind of willingness to move away from the Soviet Union? So that's something we kind of discussed earlier. It's just kind of maybe if you want to say a few more words on that.
Yeah, exactly. So it ties back to this aspect of linguistic and cultural familiarity, especially in parts like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And Kazakhstan was an interesting case where they made a decision to move away from the Cyrillic alphabet, which of course is a shock for older generations that then who overnight risk becoming illiterate. But as a political signal, it is of course a signal of emancipation, a signal of becoming more autonomous in educational and language policies. I wouldn't say that this in particular provides an entry for China to to make an inroad into language policies per se. because just changing the alphabet is of course one way that that is then tied to broader reforms in education and language policies, and of course to the receptiveness to China's own efforts of setting up language schools and Confucius institutes and teaching Mandarin, which isn't necessarily tied only to reform of the alphabet.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your talk and for answering all these questions. We have many questions today. So thank you for accepting the invitation to talk about your book. And we hope to see you again, maybe with another project to talk about, maybe another book. So
yeah, that would be great. It was great fun. Thanks for having me, and I'll promise to cough less if you invite me next time again.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. All right, thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.